Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling something pretty fundamental if you're thinking about real estate in Las Vegas.
Hmm.
The standard residential purchase agreement. We're not going to read the whole thing, obviously, but we want to, pull out the key stuff.
Yeah, the essentials. Understanding this can really save you time, money, headaches, all that good stuff.
Right. So we're looking at the Greater Las Vegas Association of Realtors Standard Form, the October 2022 version.
That's the one. And basically, this document, it's the buyer's first official move. It's their offer to the seller, all laid out.
And our goal here is simple. By the end of this, you, the listener, should have a much clearer picture of how these agreements work. First-time buyer, seasoned pro, just curious, this should help.
Definitely. So where do we start? Page 1.
Yeah, let's jump in right at the very beginning, those initial acknowledgments.
Ah, yes, the joint escrow instructions. It sets the tone immediately, doesn't it?
It really does. It basically says, by signing this, you're saying you've read it, you get it, and you agree to everything. Unless, of course, you change something later.
Exactly. It's a big statement right off the bat.
And they make you initial every single page.
Yeah. Kind of reinforces that point. Every section counts.
Then you've got the basic info, date, buyer names, the property address.
City, county, usually Clark County, here state, zip, and that important APN number.
The assessor's parcel number.
Okay.
The unique ID for the property.
Correct.
And then the big one, the purchase price.
Yeah, and notice how it needs to be written two ways, numerically and in words.
Right, like writing a check. Standard legal thing to avoid confusion.
Pretty much. A safeguard. And then there's that little checkbox right below it.
About whether the buyer intends to occupy the property. Seems simple.
It does, but it can matter later on for, homestead exemptions, maybe loan terms. It signals your intent.
Okay, basics covered. Let's get into the money, the earnest money deposit, the EMD. What's the real story there?
Well, the EMD, it's your first chunk of cash down. It tells the seller, hey, I'm serious about this.
More than just a deposit, then. It's a signal.
Exactly. And you've got options for when you give it either right with the offer, which looks stronger,
Make sense?
or on a specific date you agree on in the contract.
And where does this money actually, does the seller just hold it?
Oh, no. Once the offer is accepted, and acceptance has a specific definition later that EMD has to be deposited, usually within 1 business day, unless you write something different.
Okay.
And it goes into a safe place. Either the escrow holder, the buyer's broker's trust account, or the seller's broker's trust account. Neutral third parties, essentially.
Gotcha. Now, there's a bit in bold here that really stands out about writing bad checks.
Oh, yeah. That's serious business in Nevada. They spell it out right there, writing a check with insufficient funds for this. It's a felony.
Wow. Up to 4 years in prison and a $5,000 fine.
Yep. NRS 193.130. They're not messing around. It really shows this EMD is a serious commitment.
No kidding. Okay, so that's the initial deposit. What about this additional deposit mentioned next?
Right, that's optional. Sometimes, maybe after inspections are cleared, the buyer might agree to put down more money on a specific date.
Ah, okay.
The form has fields for the amount and the date it's due. And a key checkbox asks if this extra deposit becomes part of the main EMD.
Why does that matter? If it's part of the EMD or not?
It can affect what happens if someone defaults later, how much money is potentially at stake as liquidated damages, which we'll get to.
Okay. And any special rules around that additional deposit go later?
Yeah, Section 30, additional terms, that's where you'd spell out any specific conditions tied to it.
All right. So deposit's covered. Now financing the rest.
Most people need a loan, right?
Usually, yeah. And Section 1C is key. Contingency on new loan. This protects the buyer.
How so?
It makes the whole deal dependent on you actually qualifying for the loan. If you can't get the financing, you can potentially back out.
And it lists the common types. Yep. Checkboxes for conventional, FHA, VA, and an other option, if it's something different. You specify the loan you're aiming for.
What if someone's thinking about taking over the seller's existing loan? Is that common?
Less common these days, but possible. That's Section 1D. Contingency on assuming existing loans.
Similar setup.
Yeah, checkboxes for loan types, fields for rates, terms. But crucially, the seller must give the buyer copies of the original loan note and the latest statement within 5 calendar days of acceptance.
So the buyer knows exactly what they're getting into.
Absolutely. Full transparency on the debt you'd be assuming.
Makes sense. The agreement also mentions a financing addendum. What's that for?
That's like a supplement. The main agreement sets the stage saying, I need a loan, but the financing addendum goes into the nitty-gritty details.
Like interest rates, points, specific lender requirements?
Exactly. All the finer points of the financing arrangement.
Okay, and then the rest of the money, the down payment, basically.
That's the balance of purchase price, due before the close of escrow or COE. And it has to be in good funds.
Good funds, like not a suitcase full of cash.
Probably not. Section 24 defines it later, but think verified funds, wire transfer, cashier's check, money that's definitely there and available immediately.
Got it. And just to be super clear, that final total purchase price figure, that's just the price of the house itself, right?
Good point. The agreement specifically says that total doesn't include your closing costs, prorated taxes, HOA fees, all those other transaction costs. Those are separate.
Okay, super important distinction. Phew, that's just section 1. Let's move to page 2. Starts with compensating the buyer's agent.
Right. Section 2, buyer representative buyer broker compensation. It lays out how the seller agrees to pay the buyer's agent.
The seller pays the buyer's agent.
Typically, yes. It's usually built into the deal. The form specifies if it's a percentage of the sale price, a flat dollar amount, or maybe both. There are blank fields to fill that in.
And this part gets kind of locked in once the agreement is signed.
That's a key point. Once this purchase agreement or a counteroffer is signed by everyone, this compensation agreement involves the buyer's broker too. You can't just change it between buyer and seller anymore.
So changing the buyer agent's pay would need their written okay.
Exactly. It requires written ratification from the buyer's broker. Protects their commission, basically.
Makes sense. Okay, section 3, additional financial terms and contingencies. More on financing.
Yeah, subsection A is about the new loan application. If you're getting a loan, you have responsibilities.
Like applying quickly.
Right. You have to submit a completed loan application within a certain number of business days that blank needs filling in, and you need to give the seller a pre-approval letter.
What if the buyer drags their feet on this?
The seller has the right to terminate the agreement. If you miss those deadlines, the deal could be off, escrow canceled, and you'd typically get your EMD back.
So, time is ticking.
And it says the buyer has to use their best efforts to get the loan. You can't just sit back. You have to actively try.
Okay, what about the appraisal? That can be a sticking point.
Huge potential issue. Subsection B, the appraisal contingency. This protects the buyer if the property doesn't appraise for at least the purchase price.
So if the bank's appraiser says it's worth less than what you offered,
then you get a notice of appraised value. From that point, you have a set number of calendar days, another blank to fill in, to either try and renegotiate the price with the seller or cancel the whole deal. To cancel, you need written notice and a copy of that low appraisal report sent to the seller.
And if you cancel properly because of the low appraisal, EMD back.
Yes, full EMD refund is protected by Nevada law, NRS 645A.175 in that situation. But, and this is crucial, it's in bold caps if you don't cancel in writing by that appraisal deadline.
Uh-oh.
You're deemed to have waived the appraisal contingency. You might be stuck buying the property even if it appraised low, or risk losing your EMD if you back out later.
Wow, okay. So missing that deadline is a big deal. What about the loan itself? We talked about being contingent on a loan, but what if you just can't get final approval?
That's the loan contingency in subsection C. It confirms the purchase is contingent on you actually getting the specific loan you described back in section 1, unless you agree otherwise in writing.
And similar process. Deadline to act.
Yep. You have a certain number of calendar days, fill in the blank, after acceptance. Within that time, if you can't secure the loan, you can remove the contingency in writing if you find another way to pay, try to renegotiate with the seller, or cancel the agreement.
And canceling properly means EMD back again.
Correct. Full refund under NRS 645A.175 if you cancel by the loan contingency deadline. But again, the big bold warning, fail to cancel in writing by that deadline, and you've waived the loan contingency.
These deadlines are absolutely critical for buyers.
Okay.
What if someone's skipping the loan process entirely? Paying cash.
Subsection D, cash purchase. If you're paying cash, you have to prove you actually have the money.
How?
Within a set number of business days, another blank you need to give the seller written proof from a bank or financial institution showing you have sufficient funds available to close the deal.
And if you don't provide that proof,
seller can terminate the agreement. They need assurance the cash is real.
Right. Section 4 is quick. Sale of other property.
Yeah, simple checkbox. Is this deal contingent on the buyer selling their current home? Yes or no? If yes, you usually attach a separate contingent upon sale addendum detailing those terms.
Okay, now, Section 5. Fixtures and personal property. What stays, what goes. Always a fun topic.
Huh. Can be contentious, yeah. This section lists things that are automatically included with the sale, SIS, and free of liens unless you specifically exclude something or deal with it later under repairs.
SAS means no guarantee they're in perfect working order, right?
Exactly. You're getting them in their current condition.
And the list is pretty long.
It is. Tries to cover everything attached. Electrical, plumbing, heating fixtures, ceiling fans, built-in appliances, solar systems if they exist, screens, shutters, window coverings, attached flooring,
TV antennas, satellite dishes, pool equipment, garage door openers.
mailbox, landscaping, water softeners, security systems, the works. It aims to prevent arguments later about, I thought the fancy chandelier was staying.
Definitely covers a lot. And then there are blank lines, too.
Yeah, for additional items of personal property, this is where you'd write in things that aren't fixtures but you've negotiated to include. Maybe the refrigerator, washer, dryer, specific furniture needs to be written down.
Clear documentation is key.
Yeah.
Okay, page 3, section 6. Escrow, the neutral third party.
Right. Escrow holds the money and documents and makes sure everything happens according to the contract. Subsection A says escrow is required and usually opens by the end of the next business day after the agreement is accepted.
And you name the escrow company and officer.
Yep, blanks for that. Escrow is officially open when the company gets the fully signed agreement. They then notify everyone of the opening date and the escrow number.
Subsection B just reminds us the EMD goes into escrow.
Correct. Reaffirms what we covered in Section 1,
Yeah.
subject to Nevada escrow laws.
Subsection C, close of escrow, COE, the finish line date.
Exactly. There's a blank field for the specific date everyone's aiming for to close the deal. And it notes if that date falls on a weekend or holiday, it automatically bumps to the next business day.
Practical. And subsection D mentions the IRS, tax stuff.
Yeah, it's mainly a heads up for the seller. The escrow holder has to file a Form 1099 with the IRS reporting the sale proceeds after closing. It's just a notification of that requirement.
Got it. Section 7, title insurance, protecting the buyer's ownership rights.
Absolutely crucial. This makes the deal contingent on the seller providing good and marketable title. Proof of that comes via a title insurance policy.
Who issues that?
The title company, named back in the escrow section, they issue a policy insuring the buyer for the full purchase price against hidden title problems from the past.
Like old legions or claims someone else might have on the property?
Precisely. It protects the buyer financially if something unexpected pops up regarding ownership history after they've bought it. Section 9A later says who pays for this policy.
Okay, vital protection. Now, Section 8, buyer's due diligence. This looks like a big one for the buyer.
It's huge. This is the buyer's main investigation period, but crucially, look at the very beginning, there's a checkbox.
Buyer's obligation under this RPA, IS, or is not conditioned upon buyer's due diligence.
Right. If that box isn't checked IS, then these detailed due diligence rights in 8AC don't apply. Assuming it is checked, then you fill in the blank for how many calendar days the buyer has for this period, starting from acceptance.
And the seller has to cooperate?
Yes, seller agrees to cooperate and keep the utilities and pilot lights on so the buyer can actually inspect things properly. That's key.
So what can the buyer investigate during this due diligence period? Subsection A, property inspection condition, seems broad.
Very broad. The buyer can do whatever they feel is needed to decide if the property is satisfactory to them. That includes checking insurability, looking for any unsatisfactory conditions. Flood zones, airport noise, weird smells, environmental stuff, zoning issues, proximity to freeways, schools, anything really that might bother the buyer.
And physical inspections, too.
Definitely. Non-invasive inspections. Structural, roof, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, HVAC, well septic if applicable, pool spa, surveys, checking square footage, all done by licensed professionals.
Seller has to grant access.
Reasonable access, yes. And the buyer agrees to indemnify the seller for injuries during inspections, with exceptions for the seller's own negligence or wrongdoing.
Makes sense. It also advises buyers to check out neighborhood conditions separately.
Right. The physical inspection focuses on the property itself. And a key point, if the buyer cancels because of an inspection report, they have to give a copy of that report, including the inspector's details, to the seller.
Okay, so buyer does their homework if they find something they don't like. Subsection B, buyer's right to cancel or resolve objections.
Two main options before the due diligence deadline. One, cancel the agreement. Written notice to the seller, full EMD refund under Nevada law. Simple as that.
Option 2,
Try to work it out. Resolve the objections with the seller through a written agreement, also before the deadline. Maybe the seller agrees to repairs or offers a credit.
And what if the buyer does nothing? Subsection C, failure to cancel or resolve objections.
If that deadline passes and the buyer hasn't canceled or reached a written agreement on objections, they are legally deemed to have waived the entire due diligence condition.
Meaning they're stuck moving forward.
Pretty much. They've lost their chance to back out based on those due diligence findings. Again, those deadlines are rock solid.
Absolutely critical. Okay, page 4 continues with inspections under subsection D. Seems like some overlap.
A bit of reinforcement, yeah. Reiterates the buyer's right to inspect using license pros, seller's duty to keep utilities on, strongly recommends Nevada licensed inspectors.
And it stresses again the consequence of not acting within the due diligence period.
Yes. If you don't complete an inspection and deliver any repair requests within that period, you've waived that specific inspection, and the seller isn't liable for repairs it might have found, unless required by law.
And who pays for all these inspections?
Typically paid outside of escrow by whoever is designated. This subsection has that detailed list. Again, home inspection, pest, pool, roof, etc., with columns to check off. Seller pays, buyer pays, 50/50, waived, or NA.
Very clear breakdown. Subsection E talks about additional inspections and/or certifications. When would these happen?
If an initial inspection raises a red flag, say, the home inspector notes concerns about the roof or the septic system, or sees signs of possible mold.
So you bring in a specialist.
Exactly. A roofer, a septic inspector, a mold specialist. The buyer has the right to get these extra checks done, but still within the overall due diligence period. Costs are handled the same way, usually outside escrow unless agreed otherwise.
And the certification isn't a guarantee.
Right. The form clarifies it's not a warranty. It's the specialist's opinion at that moment in time.
Got it. Finally, for this section, subsection F, buyer's request for repairs.
Right. Buyer's responsible for inspecting thoroughly. Based on the seller's disclosure or things found in inspections appraisal that materially affect value or use, the buyer can request repairs.
What about minor stuff, like scuffed paint?
The agreement says general maintenance or cosmetic things that were visible when the offer was accepted are generally considered accepted as is, unless you specifically wrote something different into the agreement.
And the brokers don't pay for repairs, right?
Definitely not. Brokers aren't responsible for repair costs. That's strictly between the buyer and seller to negotiate and agree upon.
Okay, that covers the whole inspection and due diligence process. Huge section. Let's shift to page 5, section 9. Fees and prorations. Who pays for what at closing?
Exactly. Subsection A starts with a table for title, escrow, and appraisal fees. Similar to the inspection table, it lists common closing costs.
Like
Escrow fees, the lender's title policy, the owner's title policy that protects the buyer, the real property transfer tax, the appraisal fee, and a spot for other.
Again, columns to check who pays. Seller, buyer, 50/50, waived, NA.
Yep. Spells it out clearly to avoid disputes at the closing table.
Okay. Then subsection B, prorations. What gets split between buyer and seller?
These are ongoing expenses that get divided based on the closing date the day the deed is recorded.
Like property tax.
Property taxes are a big one. Also rents, if it's a rental, loan interest, if assuming a loan, HOA fees, trash sewer service fees, payments on special assessment bonds or improvement districts, SIDs, sell IDs.
What about tenant security deposits if it's a rental?
Good question. Security deposits, any prepaid rent, or future lease credits held by the seller get credited to the buyer at closing.
And how are these calculated?
Based on a 30-day month, figured as of the COE date using the best info available then. If adjustments are needed after closing, buyer and seller have to sort that out directly between themselves.
Okay, subsection C covers the preliminary title report, or PTR. We mentioned title insurance. How does this report fit in?
The PTR is the title company's initial report card on the property's title. They issue it to the buyer usually within 10 business days of escrow opening.
What does it show?
It lists any potential issues found in public records, liens, easements, restrictions, anything that could affect clear ownership.
And the buyer gets to review this.
Yes, buyer has 5 business days after receiving the PTR to review it and either approve it or object in writing to specific items listed as exceptions.
What if the buyer doesn't object?
Then the PTR is considered accepted as is. If the buyer does object, the seller has 5 business days to try and fix the issues.
And if the seller can't fix them?
Buyer has a choice. Terminate the agreement and get their EMD back, or proceed with the purchase and accept the title with those unresolved exceptions.
And those accepted issues become permitted exception.
Exactly. Those are the things the owner's title policy won't cover because the buyer agreed to accept them. So reviewing that PTR carefully is critical.
Definitely seems like it.
Yeah.
Okay, page 6. Closing fees and home protection plan. More costs.
Subsection D focuses on whether the seller will contribute money towards the buyer's closing costs. There's a blank to write in a dollar amount the seller agrees to pay.
Can they specify what costs that money covers?
Yes, checkboxes indicate if that contribution can be used for things like lender fees, title escrow fees, other closing costs, or if it excludes certain costs may be required by the buyer's loan program. It also notes different loan types, FHA, VA, conventional, have different requirements that affect costs and rights.
Okay, and subsection E. Home protection plan. A home warranty.
That's the common term, yeah. A service contract covering repairs or replacement of major systems appliances for a period after closing.
Is it required?
No, it's optional. The buyer can waive it or require one. If required, you specify the plan, who pays, seller or buyer via checkboxes, and maybe a maximum cost. Buyer usually orders it.
And the brokers don't guarantee the coverage.
Nope. Big disclaimer. Seller and brokers make no promises about what the plan covers or what the deductibles are. Buyer beware, read the plan details.
Good advice. Section 10. Transfer of title, the main event.
This is it. At COE, buyer pays the money, seller delivers marketable title.
Free of liens, except
for current property taxes, which are prorated, any CC&Rs, covenants, conditions, restrictions, common in HOAs, zoning rules, and utility easements, and anything else the buyer specifically agreed to accept before closing.
and a heads up about property taxes possibly changing after the sale.
Yes, important reminder. The county might reassess the property value after you buy it, which could change your future tax bill up or down.
Something for buyers to budget for, potentially. Okay, Section 11. Common Interest Communities, or CICs, HOAs, basically.
Exactly. If the property is in an HOA or similar community, this section kicks in. The seller must provide the buyer with the CIC resale package,
What's in that?
governing documents, rules, bylaws, financial statements, meeting minutes, info on fees and assessments, all mandated by Nevada law NRS 116.
And the seller pays to get this package.
Yes, seller's expense. They have 2 business days after acceptance to request it from the HOA, and then 1 business day after receiving it to give it to the buyer. Timelines are tight.
And the buyer gets time to review all this HOA info.
Crucially, yes. The buyer has until midnight of the 5th calendar day after receiving the complete resale package to cancel the entire purchase agreement without penalty if they don't like what they see in the HOA docs.
Wow, a 5-day escape hatch based on HOA rules. How do they cancel?
Written notice delivered personally, by mail or electronically with confirmation. Also, if the buyer doesn't even receive the package within 15 calendar days of acceptance, they can cancel then too.
And EMD back in those cases.
Yes, full EMD refund if canceled properly under these CIC provisions. If the buyer doesn't cancel within the time frame, the CIC package is deemed approved, and the seller has to pay any outstanding HOA fines before closing.
There's also a table for CIC-related fees.
Yeah, it lists common ones like the fee for the demand statement, any capital contribution fee for new owners, inspection fees, transfer setup fees. Again, checkboxes for who pays, seller, buyer, or split.
Okay, HOAs covered. Page 7, Section 12. Disclosures. What does the seller have to tell the buyer?
Nevada law requires several disclosures. The seller has 5 calendar days after acceptance to provide them. Checkboxes confirm they've been given.
Like the main property condition disclosure.
Yes, the big one is the Seller Real Property Disclosure Form, SRPD. Also, open range disclosure if applicable, construction defect claims disclosure if the seller knows of any past claims.
Anything else?
Lead-based paint disclosure for homes built before 1978, federal law. There's also a, hey, it's a smart home disclosure, a solar panel addendum if there are panels, and a spot for other agreed-upon disclosures. Transparency is key.
Definitely. Page 8, Section 13 is about fair housing.
Standard but vital. States the property is offered without discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, age, gender identity, familial status, sexual orientation, ancestry, or handicap per federal and state laws.
Good. Section 14. Walkthrough inspection, the final look-see.
Exactly. Buyer gets to do a final walkthrough, usually within a few days specified before closing another blank field to fill in.
What's the purpose?
To verify the property is in basically the same condition as when the offer was accepted and that any agreed-upon repairs have been done correctly. Seller needs to keep utilities on for this.
What if something's broken or not repaired?
That's what the walkthrough is for, to catch those issues before closing. It also notes if the buyer skips the walkthrough, they're generally accepting the property's condition and releasing the seller from liability for things a walkthrough would have found.
So don't skip the walkthrough. Section 15, delivery of possession, getting the keys.
Right. Seller delivers possession keys, codes, garage openers upon COE outside of escrow. Options are provided for when the seller vacates, either at COE or by a specific later date time written in.
What if the seller doesn't leave on time?
They're considered a trespasser, and the buyer has legal options. Any stuff left behind is considered abandoned.
Okay. Section 16, risk of loss. What if the house burns down before closing?
Nevada law, NRS 113.040, generally governs this. If a material part of the property is destroyed before title or possession transfers, the seller usually can't enforce the deal, and the buyer gets their money back. Risk generally shifts to the buyer after they get title or possession.
Makes sense. Section 17, assignment. Can the buyer just sell their contract to someone else?
Generally, no. Unless agreed otherwise in writing by everyone, the agreement is non-assignable. The original buyer is the one obligated to close.
Got it. Section 18, cancellation of agreement. Summarizes what happens if the deal falls through.
Pretty much. If canceled properly per the contract terms, like a contingency failing, buyer gets the full EMD back via signed cancellation instructions. But generally, neither party gets reimbursed for expenses like inspections or appraisals they paid for along the way.
Okay. Now, Section 19 on page 9. Default. What if someone breaks the contract?
Big consequences. Subsection A is about mediation. Before suing, with one exception, buyer and seller agree to try mediation first to resolve disputes. Costs are split.
What's the exception?
Buyer suing for specific performance, trying to force the seller to actually sell the property as agreed, doesn't require mediation first. Parties should get legal advice on this clause. Initials confirm understanding.
Okay. What if the seller defaults? Subsection B.
Buyer has all legal rights. They can sue for specific performance or sue for actual monetary damages they suffered because the seller backed out or breached the contract.
And if the buyer defaults? Subsection C.
Usually, the seller's sole legal remedy is to keep the earnest money deposit as liquidated damages.
Why liquidated damages?
The contract says it's hard to calculate the seller's actual damages if a buyer walks away, so the EMD is agreed upon beforehand as a reasonable estimate of those damages. Any additional deposit not part of the EMD usually goes back to the buyer.
So buyer default usually means losing the EMD, and that's it for them. Page 10, section 20, more on escrow, dealing with disputes.
Right. If there's a lawsuit involving the escrow, buyer and seller agree to protect the escrow holder from costs and liability unless it's due to the escrow holder's own negligence or misconduct.
What if buyer and seller give conflicting instructions to escrow?
Escrow holder has the right to file an interpleader action, basically hand the disputed funds docs over to a court and let the judge decide who gets what. This releases the escrow holder from further responsibility. Their job is just safekeeping and following agreed instructions.
Okay. Section 21, unclaimed funds. Money left in escrow.
If funds sit in escrow long enough to be considered legally abandoned under Nevada law, the escrow holder can charge a small monthly fee, like $5, against those funds until they're claimed.
Prevents funds from sitting indefinitely. Page 11, section 22, broker's compensation again.
Reinforces section 2. Seller agrees to pay the broker's commissions as agreed. Importantly, it makes the buyer's broker a third-party beneficiary, meaning they can sue the seller directly for their commission if the seller defaults and causes the deal to fail.
Interesting. Section 23, hold harmless and waiver of claims, limiting broker liability.
Very much so. Buyer and seller state they aren't relying on broker statements unless written in the contract. Buyer acknowledges buying asses where is without warranties unless specified.
And the buyer takes responsibility for checking things out.
Yes. Buyer agrees it's their job to satisfy themselves about the property's condition. Square footage, broker estimates aren't guaranteed, environmental issues, flood zones, zoning, tax consequences, etc. Buyer waives claims against brokers for these things and assumes responsibility for due diligence.
And broker liability is limited.
Yes, typically limited to the amount of the commission they received on that specific transaction. It heavily emphasizes buyer diligence.
Okay. Section 24, spanning pages 11-12. Definitions. Crucial for understanding terms.
Absolutely vital. Defines key terms legally. Acceptance, business day, calendar day, close of escrow, COE, default, EMD, good funds, and many others. Always refer back here if unsure about a term's precise meaning in the contract.
Good tip. Section 25, signatures, delivery, and notices, making it official.
Covers how it's signed. Counterparts, digital fax signatures, okay. Also specifies how official notices must be delivered. Mail, personal delivery, overnight, fax, email to the agent, and when they're considered received. Cancellation notices also need to go to escrow.
Section 26, IRC 1031 exchange, tax thing.
Yeah, allows either party to structure the deal as part of a tax-deferred 1031 exchange for investment properties. The party doing the exchange pays all extra costs, and the other party agrees to cooperate reasonably.
Section 27, HUD-VAFA escape clause for government loans.
Right. If the appraisal for a HUD-VAFA loan comes in below the contract price, this clause lets the buyer back out without penalty by providing written notice of the low appraisal. Buyer can still choose to proceed if they want. Reminds everyone these agencies don't guarantee value or condition.
Section 28, other essential terms, legal boilerplate.
Important boilerplate. Time is of the essence. Deadlines are strict. Changes must be written and signed by all. Binding on heirs. Governed by Nevada law. Prevailing party in a lawsuit gets costs and attorney fees reimbursed.
Page 13 starts with a big, bold warning.
Yep, this is a legally binding contract. Urges parties to get independent legal and tax advice before signing. Followed by the Realtor Association disclaimer. They provide the form, but don't guarantee it for specific situations. Brokers advise on real estate, lawyers, CPAs on legal tax matters.
Makes sense. Then space for addendum attached, and Section 30, additional terms.
Right. This is where you list any separate documents that are part of the deal or write in any special agreements or conditions not covered elsewhere in the standard form. Customizing the deal happens here.
Okay. Pages 15-16 wrap things up with broker info and the seller's response.
Yep. Confirmation of representation identifies the broker's agents involved, their license info, contacts. Then the licensee disclosure, if an agent is also the buyer-seller or has a close relationship, they must disclose that interest per Nevada law. Check boxes for that.
And the final part, seller's response.
This is where the seller formally replies to the offer. They check acceptance, counteroffer, attaching their changes, or rejection. There's a deadline for this response. If missed, the offer expires.
And that FIRPIA thing is here too.
Right. Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act. Seller declares if they are a foreign person for tax purposes. If yes, withholding might apply. Seller agrees to provide necessary certificates. Then seller signs and dates the response.
And that's the entire agreement. Pretty much end to end.
Wow, yeah, we covered a lot. As you can tell, it's incredibly detailed. It touches everything: money, deadlines, inspections, disclosures, what happens if things go wrong.
It really does. You can see why understanding it is so important whether you're buying or selling in Vegas.
Yeah.
It's not just a simple offer sheet.
Not at all. So yeah, if you're involved in a deal here, read this document carefully, seriously, and talk to your real estate agent and strongly consider getting a real estate lawyer to review it with you before you commit.
It's absolutely solid advice. So for our final thought today, we've seen just how incredibly detailed this standard agreement tries to be, covering so many potential situations. But considering that, what kind of unforeseen issues or curveballs might still pop up in a real estate deal that aren't explicitly covered here? And how can buyers and sellers best prepare for those unknowns beyond just understanding the contract itself?
That's a great question to chew on. Something to think about, definitely.
Indeed. Thanks, everyone, for joining us on this deep dive.